Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome to Macroeconomics. Now we sort of change our glasses from the small to the big picture, looking at the economy as a whole and asking ourselves again, what is the target, or we might recall the target that we have been talking about, maximizing welfare. And how can this be done on a macro level, which means that also the actors are on the one hand the same. We still talk about households and firms, but on an aggregate level, all the households, all the firms in an economy. And we will see that the government plays a bigger role because it's the institution that influences the actions of the people, and that has the very target that we have been keeping in mind, maximizing welfare. Everybody should be as well off as possible. But also financial intermediaries, or briefly the banks, play a role here. And these are all topics that we are going to deal with in macroeconomics. We're still following the book, Economics for Business, 6th edition by David Begg and Damien Ward. You find the start page here at the editor, but there's the link also on our class web pages. And this contains also the table of contents. In the microeconomics part, we talked about microeconomics, understanding markets and competition. And now our view is towards the macroeconomy. These are the topics we are going to deal with. Chapter 9, obviously an introduction. It's about measuring, and then you can see here 11 and 12 about international relations. 13, here we go into fiscal policy, more concrete in decisions of the government and possibilities of the government to influence the income of the people, money, inflation. So what are the other possible influencing factors here? Let's go and start our introduction into the macroeconomy. The table of contents shows what we are going to talk about, starting with some introduction, business problem, and the issues of macroeconomics. The center will be this, 9.3, the circular flow of income. That's what we cover mainly in this video. And then the second video will be about national income determination and the business cycle, also something that is quite well known or available in the media, but we want to take a somewhat closer look and describe exactly what we are talking about. So what is that, and what are the things we want to do, we want to learn? We want to learn about the key concepts, the 4 key points in macroeconomics, the GDP, the gross domestic product that everybody of us knows from the news, from discussions, from newspapers, blogs, and whatnot, that this is the important indicator, and that's basically what we talk about in Chapter 9. In Chapter 10, we look at the other 3 of the 4 big targets: inflation, unemployment, and the balance of payments. Balance of payments reflecting the exports and imports, the values of the exports and imports. That's the first part in this video, followed by the circular flow of income and the business cycle then in the next video. Still, our book is called Economics for Business and our class is called Economics for Business. The idea is to talk about macroeconomics and the things that happen sort of on the big level, but on the other hand, to ask ourselves, so what can we do with this in firms, in decision making as managers? Optimize investment decisions by understanding the business cycle, knowing where we are. Use income elasticities. Here they are again. We loved elasticities already in microeconomics, and also here we at least are going to recall elasticities, especially the elasticity of income. And we are going to deal with data. It says here, find, interpret, and use data on aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is the concept of all the demand that takes place on a macroeconomic level by us, the consumers, but also by the firms, also by the government. and also by other countries, everything that is demanded on a macro level is called aggregate demand. Also, the business cycle and the variations in economic activity, uncertainty, and so on are all backgrounds of macroeconomic activity. So our book starts in chapter 9 with an overview over what happens, the business cycle, and introduces the macroeconomic issues. You can see here the key macroeconomic outputs, again, GDP, inflation, unemployment, and the balance of payments, as we said, or the trade surplus or deficit, and how they develop over time. You see here this figure 9.2, if I can read it correctly. This figure 9.2 from our book with a bit older numbers, but in class we are going to deal with the actual numbers. We are going to go to the pages of the Statistical Bureau or of international institutions like the IMF and so on, and check the current data. But these are the four big macroeconomic issues, followed by the monetary ones, the interest rate the monetary part, the interest rate, but also we are going to look at the household, the government deficit. Is there a deficit or a surplus? The answer is in nearly all cases a deficit. That's why it's just written here as government deficit. And how did it develop over time? What happens if there are external shocks like crises that we saw, financial crises, COVID, wars, and these things that influence economic activity from the outside? How do they influence the economic activity? This is something that we are going to do in class. So here at that point you can stop for a moment and think about it. But there are no concrete questions sort of here that can be answered like in microeconomics, compute the equilibrium or so, but they are very important issues. Compare and contrast 2014 with today. 2014, because the numbers in our book are from 2014, and if we say, okay, we are more than a decade later now, how did it develop, how did it change, and what does that mean? These will be things that we discuss in classes together with the other two questions. So please keep this in mind and have a look before coming to class. The more you are prepared, the better we can start here. This leads us to the first key issue of this video, as we are talking about the circular flow of income. And you see here the circular flow of income is a flow, first of all, in the first step in what we call the inner flow in figure 9.4 between households and firms. And that's something that we are going to have a look at. We have the definition. The circular flow captures the flow of economic resources and goods and services between households and firms. These flows of economic units are then mirrored by a flow of financial payment, which we refer to as the circular flow of income. So let's keep this in mind. We want to do both. We want to talk about the flow of goods and services, but at the end we are going to measure this flow by their value, and that value is reflected, is mirrored in monetary terms. So let's do this circular flow of income in stepwise in order to understand what happens here. And in order to do that, let us first think about the circular flow of income and define the different parts. In our second frame on the board, titled The Circular Flow of Income as a Model of the Macroeconomy, with a certain emphasis on model. It's the way we model, we put into what we defined as a simplified picture of a part of reality, describing what happens in the economy between the different sectors. And we heard about the two first sectors, the households and the firms, and we are going to talk about these in what we call the inner flow, the smaller inner part. What are the roles of these sectors? The first sector that we mentioned here are the households, and here it says the assumptions of the model. The assumption is that in fact it's us, it's the people, the households that own all production factors at the end. So firms that we are going to look at second are legal constructs, but they at the end belong to individual people, which means all the resources, all the, recall, production factors, labor, land, capital, and might be entrepreneurship, all this belong at the end to you, me, and other people who have a part of the capital of our capitalistic system. And households offer these products on markets which we call factor markets. So our labor, obviously, when we work in a company, we offer our labor to the company, but also all the land, all the capital belongs to us. So we supply this to firms, and that's the only way that production can even start. On the other hand, we are the ones that demand goods and services, that demand the goods that have been produced or that are produced by the firms. The firms play the counterpart, do the other thing. So what they do is they demand these production factors, use them in the production, and then supply goods and services on the markets that we have been knowing, the goods markets. So when we have a closer look at this flow, that means households provide the production factors. We might write this down here. And we only wrote down the first three, labor, land, and capital. Of course, also entrepreneurship is something that households, individual people use and start firms, found new firms, and so on. But this is basically what goes as an arrow, yet you can see here, from the households to the firms. From these production factors, the firms produce goods. And we could write some examples that might be bread, butter, haircuts, cars, holidays, and so on, everything that is produced and are provided from the firms in direction of the households. Now, these are what we call the real flows. And as we heard in the definition before, they are represented by the monetary equivalents. When I work in a company, the company has to pay for this, for the service of my labor, and we call this wages. But also if a firm rents my property in order to do their production there, then they have to pay exactly this, rent. And if I lend capital to firms in the one or the other way, the firms have to pay something to me. They have to pay dividends, they have to pay interest rates. And this is sort of the monetary equivalent of the production factors of the real flows from households to firms. The firms have to pay, and the households receive factor income. Factor income or factor payments flow in this direction, as we can see here. That's why the arrow goes in this direction. And let's write this down. You see, I made the letter Y. We already know this from microeconomics, that we typically abbreviate income with Y, coming from the word yield here. And you might think for a second before I write it down, what is the factor income coming from labor, what is coming from land, what is coming from capital, wages, rents, and dividends, or interest. That depends on which way you provided the capital to the firms. On the other hand, there is this flow in this direction from the households to the firms as the payment for the goods that we receive, and we call this consumption expenditure. That's sort of already it for the inner flow, the relation between these two, the households and the firms, and their roles that they play according to the assumption of the model. And we already have been talking about the point that these inner part here, the two arrows from firms to households and from households to firms, that these are the real flows. There's sort of really something happening, whereas the red flows are the monetary equivalents. And if we think about it, or if we look at the graph, we see that they have to be equivalent to each other. Basically, the consumption expenditure represent the value of all the goods and services that we bought, that the consumers bought from the firms. And on the other hand, the factor income represents the value of the production factors that the households provided to the firms. And if this is the case, we don't have to draw sort of all these arrows, the black ones for the real things, the red ones for the values or for the monetary equivalents, but we can restrict ourselves to talking about the monetary flows. That's why it's called the circular flow of income, as it compares or it shows the different ways, the different directions that these flows take. We also find this circular flow of income depicted in our book and our presentation, figure 9.4, where you find exactly the things that we have been writing down. So we are on our way to the complete model of the circular flow, and it says here circular flow with injections and leakages. So we see that now also other actors, not only the households and the firms, but banks, financial intermediaries, the government, and international trade are taken into account, and everything sort of that goes out of this inner flow to somewhere else, every part of our income that goes there, is called a leakage. And every sort of inflow into the inner flow, that is basically money that goes to the firms, income that goes to the firms by exports, because this is then consumption expenditure by people abroad, by government spending, by investment. That's what we call injections. Please note that consumption belongs to the inner flow, so the injections are exports, government spending, and investment. The definition of these leakages and injection is found here. Leakage, income not spent on goods and services within the economy, and injection, additional spending that does not come from income, investment, government spending, and exports. Let's add these one after the other to our model. We start sort of the big model that you can always refer to in the figure down here, showing households and firms are those who interact. And what's happening is that firms have to pay factor income to the households. Why? And the households pay consumption expenditure for the goods and services they buy, they consume. The next sector, the financial intermediaries, or just banks, are added in this way. Concerning the definition, number 3 here, financial intermediaries, banks have the roles of taking savings, deposits of savings by private actors. These are mostly us again, the households, but also firms and governments deposit money at banks. And these banks, with this, on the one hand, they earn money as a company, but on the other hand, they are also able to provide income that does not directly come from purchases, that is not directly in the inner flow, to the firms, and which makes it possible for the firms to invest, to be active in an economic way, to produce new goods and services. Without these financial intermediaries, if we do not spend everything, then the production cannot take place. That's what we see here. We have the savings on the one hand, which means income not spent on consumption, and this makes investment possible. We might illustrate this by a very simple example. If our economy only consists of one village of 3-4 farms, and they only have one good that they produce, which is wheat. So they produce this wheat and they use it to eat. And if they did this, if they in fact produced, let's say, 1,000 units of wheat, and they would also eat these 1,000 units of wheat, then there might be sort of a sort of income to the firms, but monetary equivalence, nothing that the firms could really use in order to, the firms in this sense, the farms, that they can use to produce more wheat next year. So in case we had 1,000 units of wheat and we eat everything, then next year our economy is dead. Nothing happens, and the people in our small village have to sort of step down the evolutionary ladder and become chasers and hunters again. So we better don't do this, but we only consume a part of it, 900, and save the rest. Do not eat the rest. Which means then that there will be 100 units of wheat still available for the farmers to put them as seeds into the earth, and then they are able to harvest next year again 1,000, or if there is something like technological progress, then they would harvest even more. And that makes it possible for an economy to exist, that there is a production. We have to save in order to make future production possible. So saving, not spending all the money, is not only that I say I don't spend this year, I might spend next year or in 3 years when I go abroad and I need the money then. It's sort of for me an intertemporal allocation of my means, but also for the economy. If nobody saved, then there would be no production and the economy could no longer exist. That's what we call financial intermediaries. They are between the households and the firms, and they sort of organize this this way of intertemporal allocation of possibilities. The next sector is the government, that also plays an important role within one economy. We already talked about several roles that a government has. A government has to make the economy possible. It has to set up the legal framework, as we called it, the rules, but it also has to provide quite some services, make the infrastructure, produce streets, develop regions, have security, have administration, and so on. And this has to be financed. In order to finance this, the government levies taxes from us, from the private sector. With these taxes, it becomes possible that the government spends money, and we call this G, government spending. You might note that we depict this here, taxes and government spending, but also in our definition. So here, you can see where the abbreviations come from and what they do with this. They buy goods from firms, we said, and this is what a government typically does. A street is not built by the government or by civil servants themselves, but the government orders firms to build streets, to build universities, to build hospitals, and so on. This is what we call government spending. The government has to pay for the services, the goods and services they get from the private economy in order to do their duty, in order to do what they are supposed to do. If we look at the computer I'm using, or this stylus pen here, and so on, that belongs to the government. It was bought by the Bremen University of Applied Sciences, and I, as an employee there, I use it. To buy this is government spending, to buy the chairs and the tables where you sit, to build the university. All this is government spending, but also having security, having police, having an army, and so on. All this is government spending. The last sector in our model is the relation to other countries. Up to now, we have been talking about what we call closed economy. We just look within the borders of one economy. But of course, all economies today have relations to other countries, to the rest of the world. Export goods, import goods. If our firms export, if the firms of a country export to other countries, they receive extra income. That's why the exports, is another injection. Whereas if we buy things from other countries, we have to pay for this, and this leaves our inner flow, and it's a leakage. So we have on the left-hand side the leakages, savings, taxes and imports. And on the right-hand side, investment, government spending and exports are the injections. This is it, our circular flow of income. I'd like to emphasize again, injections are investment, government spending and exports, not the consumption itself. So this is it, our model of the circular flow of income. And we might now ask ourselves, so what? What do we learn from this? What can we do with this? And in fact, this circular flow of income is a basis for the calculation or the estimation, whatever, of the gross domestic product. Because when we look at these arrows that go into the firm, the income or the inflow of all income into the firms, we see its consumption, its investment, government spending and exports. So these four together represent the value of the goods that have been produced and bought. Our definition of GDP is, or will be written down later, the value of all final goods and services that have been produced within a country in a given period of time, typically for a year or a quarter or whatever. So we can write this down as identity equations. Y equals C plus I plus G plus X, and in fact often you find X minus M, which is, to be honest, inconsequent to say we take then the net exports, export minus imports, but that's a definition that is frequently used by the statistical bureaus, so let's not forget this. Y is used as a proxy, as a way of computing GDP, gross domestic product, because it reflects this definition that we had before, the value of all final goods and services produced within a country. So GDP is consumption plus the injections. And let's emphasize this equation as it's a core. It's going to occur several times throughout the semester when we talk about government spending, when we talk about fiscal policy. It's based on this definition. Y is our first measurement of GDP, and let's also write down this definition of the gross domestic product, the value of all final goods and services produced within an economy in a given time period. So within this frame, we see an overview about the whole video, about our circular flow of income and what we do with this, measuring GDP, the different parts of the circular flow of income and the different elements of GDP. With GDP at the end, we measure something that is called national income, and our next video, the second one for chapter 9, talks about this national income. How do we do this? How do we measure that on an aggregate level for the whole economy? Thanks for watching. See you.